I knew within 22 minutes. That is how Danny DeVito, at 81 years old, describes the night his entire life changed course. Not 22 days. Not 22 months of careful courtship and second-guessing. 22 minutes, sitting across a dinner table from a young woman from Brooklyn he had just met, and somehow already understanding that she was the person he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. It is the kind of claim that sounds like Hollywood exaggeration, the sort of line a publicist writes for a magazine profile. Except Danny DeVito has never been interested in performing sincerity. And when a man who has spent 5 decades being underestimated finally says something plainly, it tends to be worth listening to. To understand why that moment mattered so much, you have to understand what came before it. Danny DeVito was born in November 1944 in Neptune, New Jersey, the youngest child of a mother who was 40 years old and, by her own later admission, had not wanted another baby. She said it herself, years afterward, with a kind of blunt honesty that families like us tended to specialize in, that she hadn't wanted him, but that she had become proud of him. It is a strange inheritance to carry as a child, that mixture of rejection and eventual pride, and by most accounts it shaped him in ways that outlasted his childhood entirely. His father ran a candy shop in Asbury Park and was, by daylight, well liked around town. But home life had its harder edges, and young Danny learned early how to read a room for danger, how to make himself small when smallness was the safest option. He also carried something the world could see the moment he walked into it. DeVito was born with a rare skeletal condition that stunted his growth and left him, as an adult, 4 feet 10 inches tall. It was never simply a matter of height. The condition affected his joints for decades, and by his own account, he lived much of his young adulthood in near constant pain that he rarely spoke about publicly, because Hollywood in the 1960s and 70s had little patience for actors who admitted to weakness. So he didn't. He carried it quietly, the way he had learned to carry most things. New York in those years was unglamorous and unforgiving for an actor who didn't look like a leading man. DeVito shared a cheap Manhattan apartment with a young actor named Michael Douglas, whose famous last name he wasn't yet trading on. They were broke together, splitting what little money they had on headshots, walking them from studio to studio because they couldn't afford postage or gas. DeVito took whatever work he could find, including a stretch standing motionless in a department store window as a living mannequin. For a period, he slept in his car and showered at the YMCA. These weren't stories he told for sympathy. He mostly didn't tell them at all until decades later, when the distance made them easier to say out loud. Along the way, there were people who wanted to change him. According to accounts DeVito has given in interviews over the years, at least one studio dangled a life-changing sum of money in exchange for facial surgery that would have made him look more conventionally castable. He turned it down flatly, and by his own telling, burned the contract rather than sign it. The line he has repeated ever since, that he would rather be a genuine version of himself than an imitation of someone else, sounds almost too tidy for a real conversation, except that he has been saying some form of it consistently for 50 years, which is usually how you tell the difference between a slogan and a conviction. By January of 1970, DeVito was 26, still mostly unknown, still carrying pain he didn't discuss and a childhood he rarely revisited out loud. On the 17th of that month, he was performing in a small, one-night-only off-Broadway production. It was not a show anyone remembers for its own sake. What people remember is who was sitting in the audience. Rhea Perlman, 22 years old, had come only because a friend was in the cast. She was a Brooklyn native, the daughter of a Polish immigrant father who worked in the toy trade, a Hunter College drama graduate who had been waiting tables at the Rainbow Room while she looked for acting work. She has said in later interviews that she barely remembers why she came that night, because once DeVito stepped onto that small stage, she forgot everything else. He wasn't tall, he wasn't conventionally leading man material, and none of that seemed to matter once he started performing. She has described being pulled toward him in a way she couldn't fully explain, and by her own admission, she didn't wait for a polite introduction afterward. She sought him out herself. What happened next moved fast by any standard. Dinner turned into hours of conversation. Within 2 weeks, Rhea Perlman had moved into Danny DeVito's apartment. They would live together for 11 years before marrying, not out of hesitation, but because neither of them seemed to feel the need to formalize what they already understood between themselves. It is worth pausing on that detail, because it tells you something about both of them. This wasn't a whirlwind built on spectacle. It was 2 working-class kids from unglamorous backgrounds who recognized in each other a kind of steadiness the industry around them rarely offered. Career breaks, when they finally came, arrived through loyalty rather than luck. Michael Douglas, DeVito's old roommate turned producer, fought to get him cast in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975, a role DeVito had actually played years earlier on stage. The film swept the major Academy Awards, and though DeVito wasn't nominated, industry doors that had been shut for a decade finally opened. Then, in 1978, against the advice of his own representation, he turned down film offers to audition for a network sitcom called Taxi, playing a dispatcher named Louis De Palma who was, by design, unlikable in nearly every scene. The show's creators fought network executives who worried about casting him. DeVito signed for less money than his co-stars were making and never complained about it. In the show's second season, Rhea Perlman joined the cast, playing a character involved with DeVito's on-screen dispatcher. Producers had no idea the two were already partners of nearly a decade. What they saw as remarkable on-screen chemistry was, in reality, two people who had already built a life together off-camera. In January of 1982, after 11 years as a couple, they married quietly, without fanfare. That same year, Perlman began playing Carla Tortelli on Cheers, a role that would earn her 4 Emmy Awards and make her one of the most recognizable comedic actresses of her generation. DeVito, by every account from those years, was among her most vocal supporters. A year later, the two of them started an independent production company together, working nights and weekends around their television schedules. Over the following decades, that company had a hand in producing films including Pulp Fiction, Erin Brockovich, and Garden State, a body of work that shaped independent American cinema in ways that outlasted either of their acting careers individually. They raised 3 children during this period, and by their own account, kept a standing rule for years that no more than 2 weeks would pass without the two of them working on something creative together. Not as a performance of partnership, but as its practice. Then, in October 2012, after 3 decades of marriage, DeVito and Perlman announced they were separating. It landed hard on people who had watched them for 40 years as one of the rare enduring relationships in an industry known for the opposite. Perlman later spoke about that period with unusual candor, acknowledging on a podcast interview that the split was genuinely difficult and that both of them had been consumed, at different points, by their own ambitions and work. But what followed defied expectation. They never divorced. Within months, people close to the couple confirmed they were reconciling, and by most accounts they went through a lengthy stretch of couples counseling together. They separated again in 2017, and still, no divorce followed. When asked directly why, years later, Perlman gave an answer that had nothing performative about it, that there was too much shared history and love between them to complicate it with the legal unpleasantness of ending a marriage on paper. In the years since, they have continued living separately, in houses less than a mile apart, meeting regularly, speaking daily. Their son has described them sharing a streaming account and texting each other while watching the same shows from different houses. When DeVito was asked about Rhea in a 2024 interview, he didn't hesitate or hedge. He described their daily conversations, their family gatherings, the fact that after more than 50 years together, they still understood how the other person was feeling without needing to ask. It is not language most people use about someone they've stopped loving. It sounds, instead, like language for someone a person never stopped loving in the first place. In more recent years, DeVito has also begun speaking publicly about the bone condition he lived with quietly for most of his life, not to draw attention to his own struggle but to advocate for children facing the same diagnosis without resources. Reports indicate he has donated substantial sums toward research over the years, much of it without his name attached to the gift. It fits a pattern with him, the burned contract, the refusal to change his face for an industry that wanted him smoother and more conventional, the quiet giving that asked for no credit. Consistency, it turns out, was the through line the whole time. Which brings the story back to where it started, and to a man of 81 finally saying plainly what he has apparently believed since he was 26. Rhea Perlman walked into a theater on a January night in 1970 to support a friend, and instead found the person she would spend the rest of her life circling back to, in one form or another. They built children,